The Crusades were military expeditions launched by Western European Christians starting in the late 11th century. Their goals were to halt the expansion of Islam, reclaim control over the Holy Land in the Eastern Mediterranean, conquer pagan territories, and restore lands once held by Christianity. For those who took part, the Crusades were also seen as a path to redemption and spiritual salvation. From 1095, when the First Crusade was called, until 1291, when the last Latin Christians were driven out of their kingdom in Syria, countless campaigns were launched, not only to the Holy Land, but also to regions like Spain and the Baltic. The crusading movement continued for centuries after 1291. However, by the 16th century, with the rise of the Protestant Reformation and the decline of papal power, the crusading spirit faded rapidly. The Crusades remain one of the most controversial chapters in Christian history. Their extreme actions and impacts have sparked intense debate among historians for centuries. Still, the Crusades played a pivotal role in expanding the reach and influence of medieval Europe. This is a three-part series summarizing key historical insights about the Crusades, brought to you by Mysteries Beyond the Veil. We hope you'll support this series. And now, let's dive into part 1. The background and preparations for the Crusades. Background. Although Western Europe still lagged behind other civilizations around the Mediterranean basin, by the end of the 11th century, it had emerged as a growing force. The region was made up of loosely organized kingdoms following a feudal structure. Despite the widespread occurrence of private wars, looting, and disputes over vassalage and inheritance, some dynasties had begun to establish more integrated and effective systems of governance. At the same time, Europe was undergoing significant transformations driven by a population boom that had begun in the late 10th century and continued into the 13th. An economic revival was already well underway even before the First Crusade. Forests were cleared, borders were expanded, and markets were reorganized. Additionally, Italian maritime powers were starting to challenge Muslim dominance in the Mediterranean. Of particular importance to the crusading movement was the far-reaching reform of the church structure during the 11th century. This was tied to the Gregorian reform movement, which allowed the popes to take a more active role in secular and social life. For example, in the year 1095, Pope Urban II had gained enough authority to convene two major church councils, despite opposition from the German Emperor Henry IV, who had long resisted papal reform policies. By the close of the 11th century, Western Europe was brimming with energy and newfound confidence. Moreover, as demonstrated by events such as the Norman conquest of England in 1066, Europeans at the time had both the ambition and the capability to launch large-scale military campaigns. This readiness coincided with a critical shift in the Islamic world. The Seljuks, a recently converted Turkic tribe from the northeastern frontier of Islam, began advancing southward and westward into Iran and beyond, driven by the fervor of new converts to the faith. The role of religion. The Crusades were also a reflection of the vibrant religious life that was sweeping across Europe, especially in the West. At the time, religious belief had a profound and complex social impact. Faith was nurtured through stories of miracles, divine signs, and visions, while natural disasters were often interpreted as the actions of supernatural forces. Ordinary believers were not passive observers of the church. On the contrary, they sometimes openly opposed clergy members they deemed unworthy. A movement for peace gradually took shape, particularly in France, led by bishops and strongly supported by the public. Religious leaders began promoting initiatives such as the Peace of God and the Truce of God. These measures aimed to end, or at least limit, violence and conflict on certain days of the week or specific times of the year. They also sought to protect the lives of clergy, pilgrims, women, livestock, and those who could not defend themselves against looting and war. One notable moment came at the Council of Clermont in 1095, where Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade. There, the principles of the peace of God were reaffirmed and expanded, laying a spiritual foundation for all of Europe to march toward the Holy Land. It may seem paradoxical that a community promoting peace would also officially endorse war. But the peace movement at the time was born out of a desire to protect the weak. Within that same spirit, a core element of the crusading movement was the ideal of aiding fellow Christians in the East. This ideal was rooted in the belief that war in defense of Christendom was not only just, but sacred. It was seen as a holy mission, one that would please God. Pilgrimage and apocalyptic beliefs. In 11th century Europe, countless local shrines preserved the relics and legacies of various saints. Yet 3 major pilgrimage centers stood above the rest: Rome, the resting place of Saints Peter and Paul; Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, which held the remains of Saint James the Greater; and Jerusalem, home to the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb where Jesus Christ was buried. Pilgrimage, long considered a devout act of faith, had by then become an official form of penance for serious sins. In some cases, it was even assigned by confessors as a sacred punishment for wrongdoers. Another widespread belief during the 11th century was that the end of the world was near. Some scholars have found evidence of strong apocalyptic expectations around the years 1000 and 1033, marking the millennium of Christ's birth and crucifixion, respectively. Others argue that this mindset continued to spread well throughout the 11th century and beyond. In certain eschatological visions recorded at the end of the 11th century, the last emperor, a legendary ruler, was often identified with the king of the Franks, seen as the final heir to Charlemagne. According to these beliefs, he would lead the faithful to Jerusalem to await the second coming of Christ. The fall of Jerusalem and the rise of the Seljuks Jerusalem, seen as the earthly reflection of the heavenly city, held a sacred place in the Western Christian imagination. As the number of pilgrims to the Holy City increased throughout the 11th century, it became clear that any obstacles to accessing this revered site could carry serious spiritual and political consequences. By the mid-11th century, the Seljuk Turks had risen to power. Initially, the Seljuks focused their campaigns southward to confront the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. However, mounting pressure from Turkic raids into Anatolia and Armenia, territories belonging to the Byzantine Empire, began to divert their attention. In 1071, the Byzantine army suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Manzikert, where Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was captured alive. This event opened the floodgates for Turkish expansion into Asia Minor, a region that had long been considered the heartland of Eastern Christendom. Meanwhile, many Armenians from the southern Caucasus migrated southward, settling near the Taurus Mountains and founding a new colony in the region of Cilicia, Scythia. The Seljuk advance continued relentlessly. In 1085, they captured the city of Antioch in Syria, one of the 4 major patriarchal sees of Christianity, dealing a serious blow to the prestige of the Byzantine Empire. Though the Seljuk Empire never fully unified under a single centralized authority, they succeeded in taking most of Asia Minor from the Byzantines, including the city of Nicaea, and brought the Islamic frontier to the very gates of Constantinople. Faced with this growing threat, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was left with no choice but to appeal to the West for help. The West answers the call by 1095. The West was ready to respond. Years of instability had disrupted political life and made pilgrimages to Jerusalem increasingly difficult, at times even impossible. Stories of danger and harassment suffered by pilgrims returning from the Holy Land spread across Western Europe and left a lasting impression on the public imagination. Even after some degree of order returned to the region, informed leaders in the West began to realize that the growing power of the Islamic world was not only a threat to the Christian East, but was beginning to pose a direct danger to the West as well. It was this awareness that set the stage for the launching of the Crusades. The appeal for help made by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos came at a moment when relations between the eastern and western branches of Christianity were cautiously improving. Earlier tensions between the two churches had culminated in the Great Schism of 1054, a formal split between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. These ecclesiastical rifts had deepened further after the Norman conquest of former Byzantine territories in southern Italy. The military campaign led by the Norman commander Robert Guiscard against mainland Greece had especially angered the Byzantines. But following Robert's death in 1085, conditions became more favorable for restoring dialogue between East and West. So, when Emperor Alexios's envoys arrived at the Council of Piacenza in 1095, they came at a time of renewed possibility. It is highly likely that Pope Urban II viewed military assistance not only as a moral duty to protect fellow Christians, but also as a historic opportunity to restore unity between the divided churches of East and West. The Council of Clermont. The Council of Clermont was convened by Pope Urban II on November 18, 1095. Most of the attendees were bishops from southern France, along with a few representatives from northern regions and elsewhere in Europe. During the council, the Church had numerous important matters and passed several canonical decrees. Among them was the reaffirmation of the peace of God, and more notably, a groundbreaking provision offering full remission of sins, a plenary indulgence, for all who pledged to aid their fellow Christians in the East. Following the formal sessions, Pope Urban II delivered an impassioned public sermon to a large and enthusiastic crowd gathered outdoors. The exact words of his speech have been lost to history, as all existing accounts were written years later and differ in detail. However, it is certain that the Pope emphasized the suffering of Eastern Christians, the harassment faced by pilgrims, and the desecration of the holy places. He urged those who had previously caused violence and disorder in Europe to now turn their martial spirit toward a sacred cause. Urban II particularly stressed the need for repentance, calling on the faithful to accept hardship as part of a holy journey of redemption. He warned that no one should undertake the pilgrimage for any reason other than the highest ideals of faith and devotion. The response was immediate and overwhelming, perhaps even more than Urban had anticipated. Cries of Deus vult, God wills it, echoed throughout the assembly. It was decided that anyone who committed to the sacred journey would wear the symbol of the cross sewn onto their clothing, marking their divine mission. Yet the call to arms did not only stir the knights and nobility. A massive wave of commoners, including peasants, townspeople, women, and even children, rushed to join the cause. This was a response that the Pope likely neither expected nor entirely desired. Their enthusiasm brought a powerful populist momentum to the First Crusade, but it also introduced unpredictable and chaotic elements to what was intended to be a disciplined and sacred expedition. The era of the Council of Clermont. The Council of Clermont marked the convergence of three decisive transformations that would shape the course of Western Christendom. First, an unprecedented wave of religious fervor surged through the masses. Spiritual devotion reached new heights, with Jerusalem holding a central and sacred place in the collective imagination of Christian Europe. Second, warfare against non-Christians came to be seen not merely as a secular conquest, but as a religious act, a deed that pleased God. The notion of crusade was transformed into a holy duty, redefining armed conflict as a form of divine service rather than worldly ambition. Lastly, by the end of the 11th century, Western Europe had developed the organizational capacity to not only plan a large-scale military campaign, such as the First Crusade, but also to launch and sustain it over time. This demonstrated a new level of political coordination, military logistics, and spiritual mobilization. Preparations for the Crusade. Immediately following Pope Urban II's speech, preparations for the Crusade began in earnest, both in the East and in the West. In the East, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos quickly realized that he would have to receive and manage a massive influx of warriors, far beyond what he had initially expected. Ensuring logistics, security, and coordination placed a heavy burden on the Byzantine court and military infrastructure. Meanwhile, in the West, noble leaders began assembling their forces. Those who had taken the cross, that is, pledged to join the crusade, began seeking ways to finance their journey. Many sold or mortgaged their lands and possessions not only to purchase arms, horses, and provisions, but also to cover the long-term costs of an expedition of uncertain duration and outcome. While official preparations were still underway, bands of poorly organized pilgrims and knights began departing early across Europe in what became known as the People's Crusade. The most notable of these was the movement led by the fervent popular preacher Peter the Hermit, accompanied by his associate Walter Sans Avoir. Their band of followers, undisciplined and lacking structure, caused disorder and violence while passing through Hungary and Bulgaria. Upon reaching Constantinople, Peter was warmly received by Emperor Alexios, who advised him to wait for the better organized main crusading forces that were soon to follow. However, the crowd of peasant crusaders became restless and uncontrollable, setting the stage for a tragic and chaotic beginning to the First Crusade. The People's Crusade and its tragic end. On August 6, 1096, the People's Crusade was transported across the Bosporus Strait into Asia Minor. While Peter the Hermit returned to Constantinople to request additional support, his undisciplined followers were ambushed by Turkish forces near Sivrihisar, referred to by the Crusaders as Civitate, and nearly annihilated. The People's Crusade ended in tragedy, but it was only the prelude to the larger and more organized campaigns soon to come. Peter's impassioned sermons had inspired waves of popular enthusiasm across Europe, especially in Germany. However, most of these groups never reached Jerusalem. One infamous example was the force led by Count Emicho of Flonheim, whose name became synonymous with brutality. His followers carried out a series of massacres against Jewish communities in towns along the Rhine River in the spring and summer of 1096, a dark chapter in medieval history. These pogroms began in Speyer, then escalated in Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, with increasing violence and cruelty. This wave of anti-Semitic violence marked a turning point in Jewish-Christian relations and is often viewed as a significant milestone in the long history of European anti-Semitism. Jewish residents, often seeking protection from local bishops or hiding in their homes and synagogues, were forced to choose between conversion and death. Many chose to die rather than renounce their faith. Chroniclers recount horrifying scenes of mass suicide, with some even killing their own children to avoid forced conversion or capture. Though religious fanaticism was not unique to Christianity, even contemporary Christian sources condemned these atrocities. Some clerics believed that the failure of the People's Crusade was divine punishment for the sins committed during these massacres. After the slaughter, Emicho's forces moved toward Hungary, but were met with fierce resistance by the Hungarian Royal Army and were ultimately defeated and dispersed. Emicho himself fled in disgrace, returning home in shame and forever marked by infamy. The official Crusader armies and the oath to the Emperor. The main Crusader forces set out in August 1096 following Pope Urban II's call and were composed of 4 major armies. A smaller 5th contingent, led by Hugh of Vermandois, the brother of King Philip I of France, had departed earlier but suffered heavy losses when their ships sank while crossing the Adriatic Sea from Bari to Dyrrhachium, modern-day Durrës, Albania. The first major force was commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine since 1087, and the only prince from the Holy Roman Empire to join the crusade. Though a German noble, Godfrey and his companions spoke primarily French. He was accompanied by his brothers, Eustace and Baldwin, as well as a relative, Baldwin of Labourg. This army traveled overland through Hungary without significant incident. Upon entering Byzantine territory, markets were established to supply food and provisions. Aside from minor skirmishes, the army reached Constantinople safely on December 23, 1096. The second force was led by Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy and son of the famed Robert Guiscard. Bohemond had previously fought against the Byzantines in the Adriatic, and thus his arrival was met with suspicion. However, by the time he reached Constantinople on April 9, 1097, Bohemond, then in his 40s, seemed eager to pursue a mutually beneficial agreement, driven by both religious idealism and personal ambition. The third and largest contingent was organized by Raymond IV of Toulouse, Count of Saint-Gilles. At 55, he was the oldest and most powerful of the Crusader princes, and may have aspired to overall command of the expedition. He was accompanied by Adhemar of Lepuy, appointed by the Pope as papal legate to the crusade. Raymond led a diverse force that included many unarmed pilgrims, whom he personally financed. His army passed through northern Italy, circled the Adriatic, and entered Byzantine lands from the south, causing significant unrest in Dyrrhachium, and even clashing with Byzantine troops before reaching Constantinople on April 21. Despite these tensions, Raymond and Emperor Alexios I Komnenos became close allies, and throughout the Crusade, Raymond remained a key defender of the emperor's interests. The fourth major force was led by Robert of Flanders, who crossed the Adriatic from Brindisi. He was joined by Robert of Normandy, elder brother to King William II of England, and Stephen of Blois, son-in-law to William the Conqueror. No reigning monarch participated directly in the First Crusade, but the majority of crusaders spoke French, prompting Muslim forces to refer to them collectively as Franks. The presence of these powerful Western armies near Constantinople, estimated at around 4,000 knights and 25,000 infantry, posed a significant dilemma for Emperor Alexios. He had to reconcile the imperial interests of Byzantium with the objectives of the Crusaders, which were not always aligned. The emperor demanded solemn oaths from each Crusader leader, requiring them to return any former Byzantine lands they might reclaim from the Turks and to swear loyalty to him for the duration of their stay in imperial territory. This was based on the understanding that the Crusade was not meant to extend beyond the borders of the former Roman Empire, and all recovered lands were to fall under imperial authority. Only Bohemond willingly took the oath. The others did so reluctantly, with Raymond offering only a vague promise to respect the emperor's property and person. Nonetheless, Raymond and Alexios maintained a strong alliance, and Raymond became the crusader most committed to upholding Byzantine interests throughout the campaign. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you found it interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mysteries waiting beyond the veil. See you in the next mysterious journey.